everybody. This is exciting. So I'm going to be talking about my favorite thing to do in the whole entire world, which is teaching people how to code. So my objectives for you all, if you walk away with a certain amount of things from this talk, they are to know the ways that you can teach. Hint, you probably already do. You're going to be able to hopefully coach students on a learning mindset so that they can be in a positive place to learn in the first place. You're going to know the mechanics of putting a lesson together and actually teaching it. And then we're going to go over oodles of advice and things that I wish that I knew when I started teaching. So why am I even talking about this in the first place? So learning to code for me was unnecessarily hard because of my college education. I grew up in a tiny little town without even a stop sign or without stoplights or a grocery store. And I didn't know what coding was until I got into college. I stepped into a computer science classroom thinking that I was going to learn all about formatting Microsoft Word documents. That's what I thought computer science was. And instead, I was handed a piece of paper with Python code on it and was told to type it into a computer. And it was magic. I was typing these things in, and something else was coming out, and that was really, really cool. But it got harder from there. After that class where I decided I was going to become a computer science major, I was in a C++ class trying to learn data structures and algorithms on top of C++ itself. It was a weed out class. I made it through the weed out class, but at the end of it, I thought that programming wasn't for me, and so I quit. I was no longer a computer science major. So then I started teaching myself how to code because at work, I realized that I could automate a lot of my own job if I wrote code to automate it. So those Python skills, they transferred over. And then I accidentally became a software engineer from that same job. But in college, I was an education minor. So teaching people was so much fun for me. I was in middle schools teaching people how to code, and that was a really cool process as well. As I became a software engineer and worked my way through a couple levels at work, I started getting more and more involved in the community in my city in Washington, D.C. And there, I was being asked to teach workshops and mentor people, and it came back all to the things that I learned when I was in an education classroom. And I could also use the learnings that I had that would have helped me, and so that I wouldn't have quit computer science when I was in that classroom. From there, some of my best friends started working at a coding bootcamp, and they poached me. And so I now am a lead instructor and distinguished faculty member at General Assembly's Coding Bootcamp. And it's the best job in the world. So I get to teach people how to code. They get to go from hello world to professional software engineers in roughly 12 weeks. It's a wild journey for everybody involved, including me. But I also get to teach teachers how to teach now, and that's really magical as well. So I also started making content on the internet 2 years ago. So I've taught thousands of people to code in person and millions online, which is a really cool thing to be able to say. And those people have been from all different walks of life. Newbies, 8th graders, junior engineers, the people that I was mentoring when I was at work, the people in the community, all different types of people I've had the privilege of teaching. And you probably teach people as well. You may answer people's questions on Stack Overflow or Dev or Twitter. You may mentor a junior developer at work or just work with other people on the job. You may start to create content. You may write blog posts. And you may even manage people or speak at conferences like I am right now. And everything that I tell you today will apply to every single one of these things. You don't have to quit your job and become a bootcamp instructor like me, but you should. It's fun. So what have I gained from teaching? It's so much to even put on one slide, but the first thing is reinforcing your own knowledge. Again, most of my knowledge is self-taught, so there are a lot of holes in that. And the first time I was prepping for lessons, I was realizing those holes and filling them in for myself. So I learned the history of JavaScript, the JavaScript fundamentals in more detail, all the things that I skipped over to move on to React because I was, becoming a developer in 2015-ish during the framework wars days. And I can build an Express CRUD app in like 15 minutes because of teaching it so many times. I can delegate things to other people. So instead of having to do everything myself, I can teach somebody else to do what I used to do. So there can be a lot more me's. I don't have to do everything myself. People think that you're an expert. I thought I was giving a talk on augmented reality today, but this was like last week when I was looking at the schedule. I'm not an expert on augmented reality. I wrote a blog post about it, and people read that blog post, and then they started to ask me to come speak about it. And so people think that you're an expert on things because you write about them, even if you're not. And then the best part is that you get to help people. You get to see their journeys, you get to add more people to the industry, and they get to learn things from you, and that's pretty cool. So I want to transition into talking about the mindset behind teaching and the things that you have to coach your students on in order to make them successful. Because the most important part of teaching isn't necessarily teaching them any individual framework or line of code or anything like that. It's teaching them how to teach themselves. And so we're going to talk about the mindset that you have to coach your students to in order to make them successful. Learning anything is really, really hard. Learning programming is even harder usually. It's hard to put yourself in that beginner's mindset again. I work with people who were corporate executives, and then they're going back to absolute zero in a classroom and writing a hello world. And that's something that's really, really hard for people to do. You have to put yourself in their shoes. What was it like for you to learn something really hard? I try to make it so that I'm always trying something new and always putting myself in beginner's shoes so that I can empathize with my students. So doing things like starting CrossFit or any of those things that I am new at will make me relate more to my students. You also have to coach them into embracing this challenge. It's really, really hard, again, to learn anything new. And so if you have to coach them to embrace that and be excited about it and not be fearful of it. Because as developers, we're learning new things every day. You probably have learned new things over the course of this conference, and having that growth mindset of that new thing being awesome and something really cool to learn is a huge component behind learning to code. So having a growth mindset and being excited about learning new things and changing is a huge part of that. There's this idea of the emotional cycle of change. So you probably go through this multiple times a day as a developer. So first you start off with uninformed optimism. There's this new shiny framework out there and it looks awesome. This is so much fun to do. I want to learn all about it. And you write the hello world's easy enough, you got it. But from there, you start to struggle a little bit. It gets a little bit harder. You get into the informed pessimism, where you are trying to Google a bug, you're not finding it, it's really challenging, and you're at the point where you may get to the valley of despair, where you want to quit and throw your computer out the window and not do this anymore. And then you get to informed optimism when you actually solve that bug, or you get to the end of your app. And then you get to the point of success and fulfillment, where it's awesome again and programming's so much fun, and now you get to learn the new JavaScript framework. So this emotional cycle of change is something that people go through all the time, but just telling them that they're going to go through this is part of the battle. So letting them know that it's going to be hard, that you're going to go through these cycles is a huge part of learning in itself. People want to see this linear trajectory if they start at nothing and then keep moving up incrementally from there, but it's more of a cycle. And it's not just this one cycle, it's more like this. So again, the biggest thing you can instill in a student is teaching them to teach themselves, because I can't teach everybody every single thing that they need to know. Instead, I need to give them the toolkit that they can use themselves in order to teach themselves things in the future. It's not scalable for me to teach them every single new thing that comes out or every single method in a library that they need to know. That's what the documentation is for. You need to teach them to use those tools that you also use to program in order to teach themselves and further their own knowledge. So that's one of the biggest things that you can do as a teacher. You're also trying to build a classroom culture where every single person can contribute. So everybody feels safe to learn in their own way. There's so many things that you can do for this. Even just doing icebreakers on day one so everybody knows each other is a huge part of the journey. But from there, making it so that no person is dominating the conversation and no person is completely left out of it as well, facilitating everybody being part of the conversation. Making it so that people from diverse backgrounds can all contribute. You're also trying to instill confidence in them. I've seen so many people who are taken down out of this industry because of imposter syndrome, myself included at parts of my career. And so instilling that confidence in them, letting them know that all of this is normal and that they're doing cool things is a huge part of the process. And the wins are going to happen and celebrate them when they do. After every single project that my students do, I have a retrospective. The first part of the retrospective, they talk about the things that they struggled with, the things that are still problem areas for them, the things that they still want to contribute to their projects afterwards, fun things that they learned during the project that we didn't teach in class. And then the last part is just their accomplishments. So everybody gets to come in and say things that they accomplished during that project. Got to celebrate all the high parts in order to overcome those low parts. So now that we've talked about the mindset and what goes into coaching people to actually learn, we're now going to talk about the actual mechanics of a lesson. So what does a lesson plan look like? How do you break these things down? So the first part is learning objectives. My first slide for this talk was what you're going to be learning in this talk. I told you the different header slides that I'm using. And in a lesson, this is something that really helps students as well, especially adult learners. Adult learners always want to know what comes next and what they're going to actually accomplish. And so warming them up and telling them that at the very beginning of the lesson goes a huge way. It also makes it so that you get less off-base questions so that people aren't trying to ask you 8 steps ahead of where you're actually at. They're just asking you where you're at. The next part is framing. Why should they care about this piece of information? Why do they need to know React? Why does it make it better? Why does it make developer processes easier than vanilla JavaScript? Why do they need a database? Why are everything that we're learning so important? Why will they use it in the industry? And why do they need to learn it? Knowing that why behind it is a huge part of the process, and just letting them know that these things are actually important goes a huge way. And then comes the actual lesson itself. I structure my lessons in this way. So I do is more of a traditional lecture type format where I'm telling people about this thing. Then we do the we do. This is a code along. So I am writing code in front of the classroom and everybody is also typing it on their own machines. Them typing it along with me makes it cement in their mind. And so that's definitely a pretty important step. And then group activities. So if somebody didn't fully understand something in the first part, then they can teach each other in those groups. And the stronger students get their chance to excel and to teach something to the other classmates. And then the last part is you do, which is individual work. That can come in the form of homework. So instead of having to have all of these always within the actual lesson itself, it is distributed that way. So this is the format that I follow for my lessons over and over and over again. So each one of these sections will be roughly 10 minutes, and those repeat throughout the lesson. Hands-on practice. It's impossible to learn something without actually applying it. So that's why I normally try to do workshops instead of talks at conferences, because people learn better in that format where they're actually applying what they're learning, they're writing the code themselves, they're extending their knowledge in that way, and they're actually applying what they're doing. So hands-on practice, writing the code themselves, not just theoretically talking about what each piece is a huge part of the process. And then checks for understanding. So you can just look out into the crowd sometimes and know, okay, that person's lost, but actually making it so that you know for sure whether people are understanding it or not is big as well. So this can come in the format of doing like mini pop quizzes that are ungraded throughout the class. I sometimes ask questions and have people write it on the whiteboard tables in front of them. Slack polls, just asking informal questions to the class so that you're actually checking to make sure that the students that need to understand this are. And then comes all my teaching advice. So the first part is to know your audience. So who are you actually speaking to? What are they trying to learn? If you are teaching a bunch of brand new beginners and you're using a bunch of jargon that they don't understand, it's not gonna work well. It's gonna go over their heads, they're not gonna learn it. But if you're teaching industry experts about something and you're explaining to them what a variable is, they're gonna tune out because they think that that information is not tailored for them. So know your audience, know who you're talking to, know where they're at. Set clear expectations. What are people trying to learn? What is actually important from this lesson? What's bonus? What are the clear things that they need to take away? And if you're doing things like grading, what are you going to be looking at when you're grading something? What are the steps that they need to do? What are the questions that they need to answer? And also setting clear expectations with students of only ask questions during these amounts of times. Don't just interrupt me when I'm speaking, or don't speak over other students, or all of those classroom culture things that make it more productive for everybody to contribute. That's all important to set up front as expectations. I have my students do a classroom constitution on the first day where they create their own rules for the classroom. That's not coming from me, that's coming from them. They all have to stick to it because they all came up with it themselves. You're also having to create a safe place to fail. So this is what I didn't have in my computer science classroom. I was pulling all-nighters to try to just get things done or get through the basics of things. And there wasn't a place where you could go down the wrong path and make up for that. That's part of development, especially when you're learning. When you're brand new at learning, you may go down totally the wrong path when you're in an assignment, and it's really hard to correct course. And so making that a part of your curriculum or your learning path is so important. So I do things like having makeup assignments if people miss things, also making it so that there are places to make up anything that they miss. Linking is one of the most important things that I took away from studying education in college. So linking is when you take something that somebody already knows and then teach them something new, but in context of what they already know. Teaching something new in complete isolation when they have no idea what's going on at all is nearly impossible to learn. We don't learn that way. So if I told you that a variable is a bin for information and you had no idea what a variable was, that wouldn't really help anything. But if I instead linked it to algebra class, and I said that in algebra class you had this thing x, and it was set to 1 or whatever, and you've seen this before, that makes it so much more powerful and makes it so that they understand something in context of what they already know. There are also going to be a lot of different learning styles in your classroom, or if you're mentoring somebody, they may have a different learning style than other people. So for example, people always ask me what my favorite video courses are, and I say that's a trick question. I don't like video courses. I don't learn well from them at all. I learn well from reading, I learn well from documentation, and so that's where I go to learn. Everybody has a different learning style. And so some people like visual diagrams. Other people like actually applying what they learn. Some people need to have more context behind what they're learning. Everybody learns slightly differently, and so try to hit multiple learning styles when you're teaching. In addition to that, the nice thing about teaching to multiple learning styles is that you can essentially teach the same information over and over again in different ways. And so that's a built-in way of reviewing things, and they don't even realize it. So you show them a video on something, then you teach it yourself, and then you have them apply it, and that's the same context content 3 times, but in 3 totally different ways, and nobody realizes it. Use the best practices yourself. Usually if you're teaching something, you know it pretty well. Use those best practices that you know. So use clear variable names, write clean code, follow all those best practices. Don't use foo, bar, baz, nobody knows what that means. Use the best practices that you would use in the wild. It'll be more relevant, but it'll also be more understandable. Those are the best practices for a reason. And again, you can go over information multiple times. Use real-world examples. So if you did something at work at some point in your career, use that as an example in your classroom. So instead of just telling them, hypothetically, this is what other people do, instead, my team uses React, and this is why it's important. This is what problem it helped me solve. All of those types of stories make it so that people care about it. They think it's important, but it also makes it so that it fits in the context of what they're going to be doing in the future. So use those real-world examples in order to engage students. And mirror the career world in your classroom. So some things that I do are I have stand-ups for my students daily, so they have to say what they're doing, their highs and lows and all of that, similar to a stand-up in the real world. They submit pull requests for their homework assignments, so instead of just submitting a Google Doc or something like that, they're making pull requests and getting that practice in. For some projects, I make them submit issues on GitHub instead of just directly asking me questions. All of these things mirror what they would be doing in the future. And so I'm teaching them all of those industry best practices, even though they're focusing on something else there. I've even had friends think about using Jira for class, and I'm not really sure how that will work or how I feel about it, but it's an idea, it's out there. But also make it fun sometimes. So being in a classroom for a long amount of time is draining and cannot be super fun sometimes. And so I like to use things that are fun and engage students. So if I notice that students are really dragging one day, I usually have them build a Britney Spears fangirl app because people think that's funny and makes it so that it's a lot more engaging for learners. Also, there's a dad jokes API, super fun. And also something that mirrors the real world, like using an API for anything is awesome. You're also trying to teach the why and the how. So the mechanics, the context, but also why you're using this, why you're doing this a certain way, why this best practice matters. All of that is important too, not just the syntax. If I was just teaching people this is how you set a variable in JavaScript, that doesn't make any sense, that doesn't help anybody, but if I teach them why they need it, that's so much more important. I've made it so that occasionally I will just give students cheat sheets for things because the syntax is not the most important thing. They have a text editor, they have error messages to let them know about syntax issues. And sure, it's important to know, but the why is what transfers from language to language, from framework to framework. All of those things are important as well. Another thing that I see a lot, especially with engineers moving on to teaching, is that they teach everything that they know, not what's necessary, and not for the students, it's for their own ego. So I was recently reviewing a lesson where when they were teaching variables in Python, it talked all about the underlying C code that was written in order to make it so that you could make a variable in Python. Great information, awesome. Not something that they need to know at that point, and not something that makes understanding what a variable is more easy. And so make sure that what you're teaching them is actually necessary and actually makes it so that they are learning something new, not just because it's a thing that you know. Facts are awesome, fun facts are great, but scale it back to what they actually need to know. Teach the pool or not the ocean. People's attention spans are 11 to 13 minutes long. I want to say this again. People's attention spans are 11 to 13 minutes long. That's something that I've been loving about these keynotes is that they're 15 minutes. They keep people engaged. Longer sessions are harder for people to stay focused in. And so that's why I've rotate through that I do, we do, you all do, you do, because those can be broken into those 11 to 13 minute segments that keep everybody engaged. That's one of my biggest problems with computer science education, is that a lot are in lecture halls with a bunch of people and it's just somebody talking for 2 hours. And people don't really learn well in that because they're not engaging with material, and it goes on for a lot longer than 11 to 13 minutes. So sorry you all that this is way longer than your attention spans. You're also going to be trying to teach mostly to the middle. Most of the students are going to fall into the middle of the class as far as skill level goes. So you're tailoring your lessons mostly to them. There are going to be outliers. That's how it works. There are going to be people that really struggle with material, and that's going to be different people at different parts of it. There are also going to be incredibly strong people as well who came in with prior knowledge or coding just clicks for them. And so those are the people that you spend your one-on-one attention on, instead of that classroom lecture where you're trying to get everybody. So you have your TAs focus on those people. You have tiered activities, which means that instead of just having one assignment that everybody's doing, you have a basic assignment that everybody should work on, but once they finish those, there are bonus activities so they can keep extending their knowledge and can keep challenging themselves if that's something that they need. Tangents usually confuse people. So I have a lot of amazing teacher friends who are super prone to tangents, and they're still awesome teachers, but it's going to be a lot more helpful to stay on topic, stay on the lesson plan, tailor into those learning objectives, make sure you're coming back to those instead of going off on different tangents and telling all these different random stories that probably won't actually help people. Said this before, but break down jargon. Don't use a bunch of words that don't mean anything to people. It's going to be really confusing. But you also do need to actually use that jargon in your lessons, because they're going to be needing to understand that in the jobs and in interviews. So you need to incorporate that jargon, but also explain it. And not just explain it the first time, but explain it maybe the first 3 times. So the first 3 times you talk about what a component is, you tell them what a component is. Take breaks. So within those lessons, I try to make it so that out of every hour, roughly 10 minutes are breaks. Walking away from things is an incredible part of the learning process and super, super important, so that people can come back to concepts. There is this incredible course on Coursera that I could recommend to anybody called Learning How to Learn. And this course goes into the whole science behind how people actually learn. So one of the biggest things is that brains make connections when they're resting. So if you are just working really, really, really hard all the time, your brain isn't going to be able to link those concepts together and make those connections that make it so that learning is actually possible. So I think people think the idea of taking breaks is this fluffy idea that's awesome in theory, but doesn't actually help them. No, it's brain science. And then also coming back to concepts. So not just teaching things once, but teaching it multiple times and coming back to those things and reviewing them. Spaced repetition is the best way to learn. You also want to make it so that students can teach each other. So I talked about doing group work and pairing students in groups that they will be successful. So putting people in those groups that will be able to mentor the people who are a little bit more challenged with the material, or distributing work in that way. Also enabling the students who are really, really excelling and who are maybe less challenged by the material itself to teach those other people, because teaching is one of the best ways to learn, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, and so incorporate that for your students as well. I sometimes have lessons where I turn it completely over to the students and give them all a topic to teach themselves, and they do like lightning talks on something. And so that's a really effective way of A, making things more interesting, but B, allowing students to teach as well. I also follow this idea of gradual release of responsibility. So at the beginning of a class, I am much more there to answer every single question and help them out with their bugs and all that. But at the end of the 12 weeks, I'm not there that much anymore, because after those 12 weeks, I don't exist. I do, but In theory, I don't. So there's this gradual release of responsibility where over time, I change my teaching style and my activities so that it's more on the students rather than on me. I'm helping them less on every single question that they have so that they are more and more prepared to take this on themselves. Another one of my big soapboxes is to not rely too much on memorization. I see a lot of people when they're starting out at code who want to memorize the APIs, essentially. They want to memorize every single method. They'll make flashcards. This method does this method does that. But these things change. And you may be using a different framework, and that's something else. It's much more important to be able to find that answer, to use your Googling skills, or to understand the concepts behind something. Why does an array have a length in the first place? Those concepts are so much more important than any piece of syntax, any single API that you could memorize. So this is something that I emphasize all the time for my students. And a lot of them, for example, I just finished teaching my students Express. And if you've ever built an Express app, you have to plug in all these sorts of things and write tons of code in order to actually get an Express app running. And then one of my students asked me how to actually memorize this and how to actually remember it. And I was like, you don't need to. This is 100 steps that I'm telling you to do. You don't have to have every single one of these memorized. I don't know how to do all of these by scratch from zero. I would still have issues too. So memorization isn't the important part. Instead, understanding the concepts is. Allow students to ask questions so that they can clarify their understanding and that they can extend their knowledge if they're interested in something additional. That being said, sometimes you'll get questions that are really out of left field and not super relevant to what you're talking about. And so I do the idea of a parking lot where it's like, this is a great question, but maybe is not super relevant to the class as a whole. So ask me on a one-on-one basis, or we can come back to it on a later lesson. And teach them that it's okay to not know something. I don't know everything at all. Nobody does. That's impossible. So that's okay as a teacher. You may feel this pressure to know absolutely everything, but it's okay to say, I don't know, let's look that up together, let's learn it together. Because that's something that they're going to have to go through as well. And being able to acknowledge that as a person goes a long way and is something that they will have to do as well. And then the last piece is reviewing at the end. Again, teaching things multiple times is important, so that's what I'm going to do right now. So again, you probably already teach in some way in your life, and having teaching skills will help you to do that better. Giving people the mindset, the growth mindset, that learning is really awesome, that they don't have to know everything, that it's going to be hard sometimes is a huge part of the battle. And you have to prepare them for that. I structure lessons in the following way. I have my learning objectives, I have my framing, the why. Why is this important? I structure all the lectures in I do, which is a lecture. We do, where we code together. You do, and you all do, which are activities for them to do. Make sure that they have breaks because they need to be focused and people's attention spans are short. And then also add a review at the end. I usually do this in questions in a lecture type format. And then I had a bunch of advice for you all. It's all on this slide. I won't go back through it, but it's all here for you if you want to take pictures. Yeah, I can put them in a PDF for sure. And then keep in touch. I'm Spittel everywhere, and I'll be here for questions after.